You're listening to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, created to help you succeed in your PMP certification journey. Learn more at baremetalcyber.com, where additional prepcasts, books, and training materials await. Let's get started. Procurement exists to bring external capability into a project in a deliberate, managed way so the team can achieve outcomes it cannot reasonably build alone. Good procurement is not outsourcing blame. It is choosing where outside skill, capacity, or specialized equipment will lower overall cost, compress calendar, or reduce critical risk. The practical outcomes are clear: measurable statements of work that define deliverables, fair competition that preserves options and value, incentive structures that align supplier behavior with project goals, and a clean closeout that hands over usable capability with auditable evidence. Use procurement when an honest make versus buy analysis shows that buying advances objectives more reliably or cheaply than internal build. When you introduce procurement as a deliberate strategy, you reduce schedule risk and align incentives across parties. Procurement strategy forces teams to compare cost, capability, and time to value in concrete terms. What will it cost to hire or buy a capability? How quickly can a supplier deliver working increments? And what hidden integration risks must be managed? Market research and pre-solicitation engagements convert unknowns into manageable questions, talk to potential vendors, pilot suppliers informally, and gather rough lead time estimates before drafting a formal buy. Choosing the right competition method and phasing milestones to match the schedule keeps procurement from becoming a late surprise that stretches delivery or forces poor compromises. Make versus buy decisions should be practical and multidimensional. Cost is important, but capability, time, and risk exposure often dominate. Frame the comparison in consistent units: calendar days to first usable capability, total cost over the relevant lifecycle, and qualitative risk scores, so stakeholders compare apples to apples. Market research informs whether a robust supplier base exists or whether a single-source approach is inevitable. Pre-solicitation engagement, such as industry days or informal RFIs, gives you realistic price bands and exposes lead time constraints that will shape schedule. When the market looks favorable, structure competition and milestones to reduce integration uncertainty. Pilots, phased deliverables, and acceptance gates reduce late surprises. A clear statement of work, SOW, and crisp requirement definitions are the procurement project's backbone. Measurable deliverables, explicit acceptance criteria, interfaces, and declared non-functional needs such as performance, security, and privacy. Avoid vague language like best efforts or industry standard without a specific normative reference. Instead, attach testable acceptance criteria and point to standards documents where applicable. Include evidence and inspection methods: what tests will be run, what artifacts suppliers must provide, and how records will be stored. So acceptance is objective, not argumentative. Data handling, privacy, and security clauses belong in the SOW, where they can be designed into deliverables rather than tacked on after disputes arise. Inspection and acceptance methods must be practical and matched to risk. Simple sample inspections and certificates of conformity may be fine for low-risk consumables, while integration-level tests and security penetration results are mandatory for complex, safety, or privacy-sensitive components. Define interfaces, specifically APIs, data schemas, mechanical tolerances, so integrators know what to verify. Where possible, require suppliers to supply evidence rather than just assertions. Test logs, signed inspection reports, and traceability matrices are much more persuasive in a dispute than email assurances. This evidence-first stance shortens closeout and reduces the time projects spend wrestling with incomplete deliveries. Source selection is both a technical and governance activity. Choose RFI, RFQ, or RFP vehicles based on complexity and goals, and use weighted criteria to balance technical merit, risk posture, past performance, and price. For repeatable goods with clear specs, an RFQ and price-first approach may be apt. For complex systems where approach matters, a full RFP with demonstration or pilot phases is preferable. Document decisions carefully. Evaluation matrices, scoring rationale, and interview notes form the record that defends your award and speeds debriefing. Fair debriefs reduce protest risk and preserve market trust for future buys. Weighted criteria must be explicit and defensible. Publish how much weight goes to technical approach, delivery risk, supportability, and price so bidders understand trade-offs. Use past performance and references to validate claims, but treat references with consistent scrutiny to prevent biased sampling. Preserve options where uncertainty is high by structuring phased awards or pilots award, a small pilot to test integration, and then scale the order based on results, so you can de-risk before committing large sums. Phasing also creates natural stop/go points tied to objective acceptance criteria. Clear documentation of the selection process matters not just for legal defensibility, but for operational readiness. The selection package should produce a named supplier roster, clear contact points, and an initial transition plan that the supplier and your team agree on. Avoid handshake expansions of scope after award by requiring formal mods for any change. Establish an initial cadence of governance meetings during the kickoff to align expectations, reporting, and escalation. These rituals reduce ambiguity and make administration far easier once delivery begins. Contracts are tools to allocate risk and incentives. State plainly what family of contract you're using and why. Fixed price (FP) transfers most cost risk to the seller by setting a firm price for agreed deliverables, best when scope is clear. Time and AMP. Materials T and AMP. M. Bills for labor and materials as incurred. Useful when work can't be fully specified or when you need flexible, rapid engagement. Cost reimbursable (CR) covers allowable costs, plus a fee appropriate when the buyer needs control over approach but will accept cost visibility. Choosing the family aligns financial exposure to the uncertainty of scope and schedule. Within families, incentives and risk-sharing clauses tune behavior. Fixed price with incentive fee (FPIF) and cost-plus incentive fee (CPIF) offer levers to reward performance and share overruns in predefined ratios. Award fee arrangements pay discretionary bonuses for qualitative goals like responsiveness or innovation. Service-level agreements and credits create operational discipline for ongoing services by tying measurable performance metrics to financial consequences. Match contract type and incentive structure to your tolerance for scope change and need for supplier motivation. Mismatches create perverse incentives that erode trust and value. Clarity about change and claims paths prevents future disputes. Define formal modification processes, baseline change control points, and an impartial method for adjudicating claims. Specify what constitutes a change to requirements, who has authority to approve modifications, and how cost and schedule impacts will be calculated. Document escalation ladders so both sides know where to go when disagreements arise. Ambiguity here turns small differences into protracted delays. Clear change governance keeps projects moving and preserves working relationships. Prepare for the admin phase by running a structured kickoff that sets roles, reporting cadence, and escalation ladders so the supplier is part of the team from day one. Establish who will accept deliverables, how inspections are scheduled, and where objective records will live. Integrate supplier artifacts into your single source of truth so acceptance events and evidence are discoverable. Early administrative clarity prevents the common trap where suppliers deliver into a vacuum and projects pay the cost in integration and churn. Administer procurements with discipline. Accept deliverables only against agreed acceptance criteria, perform inspections, and process formal modifications when scope or risk changes. Maintain objective records inspection logs, signed acceptance certificates, and change orders, so audits and governance reviews have what they need. Keep cadence reviews focused, status to the contract, issues requiring change, and performance against SLAs. Consistent administration reduces friction and prevents small disagreements from becoming contractual crises. Vendor risk management is ongoing. Monitor SLA performance, define triggers for corrective action, and expect corrective action plans, CAPAs, when performance lags. Use simple, agreed metrics: on-time delivery rate, defect density, responsiveness windows, and set escalation triggers tied to remediation timelines. When chronic issues appear, move from cooperative troubleshooting to formal KPAs with milestones and consequences, and be prepared to exercise contractual remedies when remediation fails. Maintain professional relationships but document everything objectively so decisions are supported by evidence. Preserve the relationship while protecting the project. Keep communications factual, escalate with data, and avoid punitive language except when remedies are contractually required. Regular performance reviews that combine quantitative scores with qualitative feedback create channels for improvement and preserve partnership value. When termination or rebid becomes necessary, a documented history of performance and attempted remediation simplifies transition and protects continuity for users and stakeholders. Contracts must include realistic service levels, inspection methods, and dispute resolution paths so both parties know where risk is shared and when one side bears the burden. Match the incentive type to scope clarity and your appetite for seller responsibility. Fixed price for definitive scope T and AMP, M when flexibility is essential, and cost reimbursable when buyer oversight is required. Define dispute paths, including informal escalation steps before formal claims, to resolve differences quickly and preserve working relationships when marginal disagreements arise. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Incentives in contracts are levers to align supplier behavior with project goals, and it helps learning if we name the parts plainly. In a fixed-price contract with an incentive fee, begin by describing the expected cost the parties agreed up front, that is the target cost, and then name the expected profit the seller will earn above that cost. The sum of target cost and target profit is the target price. Also identify the ceiling price, which is the absolute maximum the buyer will pay under the contract, and describe the share ratio as the agreed split of any cost variance between buyer and seller, such as 30% to the buyer and 70% to the seller. Saying these elements in a simple sentence helps listeners keep the architecture of risk and reward clear without numeric shorthand. Now, explain the point of total assumption, the governance pivot where the seller begins to bear all additional overrun risk, using only words and stepwise arithmetic you can follow by ear. First, state the ceiling price and the target price, and subtract the target price from the ceiling price to find the remaining cushion the buyer has before the ceiling is reached. Next, divide that cushion by the buyer's share of cost overruns. That division tells you how much over the target cost the buyer will effectively fund before the buyer's share is exhausted. Finally, add that resulting amount to the original target cost. The sum is the point of total assumption. Pause briefly between each spoken arithmetic step so listeners can follow the subtraction, then the division, then the addition. To make that fully concrete in words, consider a neutral example. The parties agreed a target cost of $1,000 and an expected profit that brought the target price to $1,200. The contract sets a ceiling price at $1,500 and the buyer's share of overruns is 30%. First, subtract the target price from the ceiling price. That gives $300 of buyer cushion. Next, divide those $300 by the buyer's share, 30%. Dividing $300 by 30% yields $1,000. Finally, add that $1,000 to the original target cost of $1,000 to arrive at a point of total assumption of $2,000. If forecasted cost approaches or exceeds that spoken threshold, the seller is bearing the marginal overrun, and the buyer should trigger stronger oversight, scope adjustments, or formal contract changes. Different incentive families shift what moves when costs change, so explain how cost plus incentive fee differs from fixed price, with incentive fee in plain terms. In cost-plus incentive models, the buyer reimburses allowable costs, and the incentive adjusts the seller's fee rather than capping the price, so there is generally no hard ceiling that transfers ultimate overrun responsibility to the seller. Instead, performance influences fee amount. That means the governance pivot is about fee adjustment and oversight rather than a single, calculable point where the seller begins to pay. Saying this distinction aloud prevents conflation between fee mechanics and price ceilings during supplier conversations. Administer procurements with clear, repeatable operational routines that keep contractual mechanics from becoming surprises. Begin with a disciplined kickoff that names who accepts deliverables, who authorizes invoices, who is the technical integration lead, and where objective records will live. Set a reporting cadence that aligns with deliverable gates, short operational status for weekly execution, and a deeper contract review at each milestone that maps to invoices and acceptance events. These rituals make small problems visible early, reduce informal expedients, and create a record you can rely on if disputes arise later. Acceptance means inspecting against the acceptance criteria in the statement of work and capturing objective evidence of the inspection. When a deliverable is inspected, read the acceptance outcomes into the record. Who performed the inspection? What tests ran? Which pass/fail thresholds were met or missed? And what corrective steps, if any, were required? Preserve inspection logs, signed certificates, and any non-conformance reports in the project repository so auditors and follow-on teams can trace decisions. Treat informal email approvals as provisional until the formal acceptance entry is made in the canonical contract record. Manage changes through formal modifications rather than informal understandings, so scope, cost, and schedule stay aligned with governance. Require each proposed change to include a concise impact statement describing added cost, days of schedule impact, and any technical risk. Route the request through technical review, commercial assessment, and authorized approval. Record every modification and link it to the original clause it amends. This discipline prevents a slow accretion of informal scope that produces claims at closeout and preserves a clear audit trail of how the program evolved. Vendor risk and relationship management are ongoing operational responsibilities that combine objective measurement with collaborative remediation. Monitor a small set of simple metrics, such as on-time delivery percentage, defect rate per delivery, and critical issue response time, and make thresholds explicit so everyone knows when a metric crossing requires action. When a threshold is breached, require a corrective action plan that identifies root cause, specific remedies, owners, and time-bound milestones. Track those plans visibly in cadence reviews and verify closure with objective evidence rather than verbal assurance. Address chronic problems with a structured escalation path that preserves professionalism and maximizes the chance of recovery before resorting to contractual remedies. Document the problem with data. Convene a formal performance review that includes the supplier's leadership if needed. Demand a time-bound corrective action plan, and set clear consequences if remediation fails. Keep communications factual and constructive early on. Many suppliers respond to clear expectations and an agreed improvement plan. If performance does not improve, follow the contract's dispute and remedy clauses while executing a contingency or phased off-ramp to protect delivery continuity. Keep the supplier relationship professional but well documented. Hold regular performance reviews combining quantitative SLA data with qualitative feedback. Celebrate successes and make improvement requests explicit and recorded. That preserves goodwill when problems are fixable and simplifies transitions if replacement becomes necessary. Always document the outcomes of reviews and any agreed remediation so the program retains a factual history that supports later decisions about extension, rebid, or termination. Scenario: a fixed price with incentive fee project is trending toward costs that approach the spoken point of total assumption, and the program's schedule is at risk. Option 1. The buyer accepts the seller's cost forecast and allocates extra contingency funds to preserve schedule. Option 2. The buyer computes and confirms the point of total assumption, then collaborates with the seller to rescope lower value work, tighten oversight on high-variance activities, or reallocate certain tasks back in-house. Option 3. The buyer issues a formal notice of potential default and initiates source replacement. Option 4. The buyer pauses further work and demands a full, forensic cost breakdown before processing subsequent invoices. I'll give you a moment to consider that. The best next action is to compute and confirm the point of total assumption. Then engage in collaborative remediation and scope negotiation with the seller as the primary response, because that sequence balances contractual discipline with practical recovery. First, confirm, in words and numbers, where the seller's overrun responsibility begins, so both parties share the same governance pivot. Next, work jointly to identify non-essential scope that can be deferred, increase oversight on the activities driving variance, and agree short-term contingency actions that reduce schedule risk while preserving continuity. This approach uses PTA as a governance signal rather than a blunt threat, and leverages the seller's operational knowledge to find efficient fixes. The strongest distractor is pausing work and demanding forensic breakdowns before any collaborative mitigation, because that step often deepens mistrust and interrupts progress at exactly the moment the team most needs momentum to recover. Allocating buyer contingency funds can be pragmatic when schedule is paramount, but it shifts financial risk to the buyer and should be documented as a formal modification with clear acceptance of cost and schedule consequences. Replacing the seller is typically a last resort. It may be necessary if remediation fails, but it is usually slow and costly. Therefore, prefer collaborative, PTA-informed remediation first. Common procurement pitfalls are often cultural rather than technical. Ambiguous statements of work, misaligned incentives, and handshake changes that bypass formal modification processes. Ambiguity in the SOW invites differing interpretations and late disputes. Incentives that reward volume but not quality create perverse behaviors, and informal scope expansions become latent claims at closeout. Prevent these problems by writing measurable acceptance criteria, matching incentive mechanics to the outcomes you value, and enforcing simple change control that makes modifications visible and decisioned. A compact procurement playbook keeps programs both fair and pragmatic. Start with market research and a deliberate strategy. Craft a clear SOW with measurable acceptance criteria and interface definitions. Select suppliers with transparent, weighted criteria and preserve options via pilots or phases. Choose contract families deliberately and explain incentive mechanics in plain words. Administer with disciplined kickoffs, acceptance inspections, and formal modifications. Monitor vendor performance with simple SLAs and corrective actions. Use the point of total assumption in fixed-price incentive contexts as a governance signal to trigger increased oversight, scope negotiation, or formal change stated plainly and used constructively. It is a tool to recover projects, not a weapon to punish sellers. Finally, when you brief stakeholders, speak incentive math entirely in words, and use round, neutral examples so an AI reader or listener can follow the logic without symbolic shorthand. Explain each arithmetic step aloud, subtraction, division, addition, and pause between steps so the audience can hear and internalize the computation. That practice makes complex contract governance accessible and operational for everyone involved. Thanks for tuning in to the Bare Metal Cyber Prepcast, your trusted source for cybersecurity news and insights. Remember to subscribe at baremetalcyber.com so you never miss an update. And visit cyberauthor.me for best-selling cybersecurity books that equip you with expert knowledge. Until next time, stay secure and stay vigilant.